I'm delighted to have you join us today for our conversation about Agile regulation. My name is Cary Coglianese, and I'm the director of the Penn Program on Regulation at the University of Pennsylvania. We're pleased to sponsor this dialogue today about governance in a changing world, what Agile regulation is, why it's needed, how it's already being implemented in government, and how it might be made more effective. And to help us work through these questions and issues, I'm delighted that we have an all-star panel of experienced professionals in government and for some of the foremost thinkers about governmental processes and regulations in particular. Before we get underway, and before I introduce our panel members, I simply want to make everybody aware of how things will proceed today. We're going to make this a conversational engagement, and we'd like to encourage you to participate in the conversation by entering questions in the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So at any time you feel you have a comment or a question to offer, you can enter it in the Q&A portion of the Zoom platform. I'll be monitoring those, and I'll try to get to as many of those as we can. We will be recording today's event, so it will be available later for viewing on the Penn Program on Regulation's YouTube channel. With that, let me introduce our panel members, and we'll dive right into the conversation. First, I'm going to go in alphabetical order here. Ed DeSeve is the coordinator of Agile government at the National Academy of Public Administration, and he has served in a variety of leadership roles in finance, in academia, but also at the state and federal levels of government. He was a special advisor to President Obama on implementing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and also served as Deputy Director for Management and Controller at the Office of Management and Budget, as well as a Chief Financial Officer at HUD. Next, we have Michael Fitzpatrick, who is a partner at the Brunswick Group, an advisory firm. Previously, he was head of global regulatory affairs at Google and led Google's Regulatory Affairs Center of Excellence. And prior to that, he worked in regulatory advocacy for General Electric Corporation, and then previous to that as Associate Administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Obama years. Next, Yael Kariv-Teitelbaum is a Fulbright Fellow from Hebrew University, who I'm really pleased and proud and honored is joining us for the year at the Penn Program on Regulation as a visiting scholar. She has served as legal counsel for regulatory policy at the Israeli Ministry of Justice and worked on leading recent work on regulation and regulatory reform with the Israeli government. We have Heidi King, who served as the deputy and then as acting administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Previously, she served also in OIRA, as well as chief economist on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. We're delighted to have Heidi with us. Larry Rosenthal is also with us. He's on the faculty of the Goldman School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement. And he is working on research on the agile policymaking frontier, in addition to the other work that he has done on government and public administration. And last but far from least, Paul Verkuil is our final panel member, serving currently with the Administrative Conference of the United States, where he was previously the 10th chairman and instrumental in engaging and reestablishing the Administrative Conference, or ACUS, where he is currently a senior fellow. He is a renowned teacher and scholar of administrative law and regulation. He's also the president emeritus of the College of William and Mary, and previously served as the deans of the law schools at Tulane and Cardozo. Let me start with you, Paul, actually, since you were so instrumental in reestablishing ACUS, which, as those of you in the audience who don't know, is a government agency, a federal agency aimed at issuing recommendations on improving administrative processes. Can I ask you, based upon your experience and your research, what do you see as some of the main challenges facing government today? And how do you see Agile regulation as a possible solution to some of these challenges?
Good afternoon, Cary. Yes, thank you so much. Let me say a few things about Agile, which is a term that we're going to be discussing all day. But and I must say, I didn't know I was Agile until recently when I learned the term, but I have other synonyms for it. When we restarted the administrative conference, I had the privilege, after being sworn in by then Vice President Joe Biden, as the chairman in 2010 in April. And I had to stand up. It's called stand up an agency. That's quite an unusual opportunity in government. So I did that. And in order to do that, agility had to be my foremost qualification. I came from academia. I'm by nature a pragmatist, and pragmatism relates very much to Agile. But in order to get the agency stood up, I had to find a place to live for the agency, furniture to put in the rooms that we finally got, and hire a staff. I was the only one. I was sitting by myself. And 4 months later, all of that was achieved. And I can assure you that of course, I call them workarounds. I had to work around a lot of things, especially the General Services Administration, getting leases. I can only begin. That's enough. But the point is, workarounds were crucial as Agile government. The agency, ACUS, I tried to instill it with this notion that we should be doing good things and finding ways to do new things. And so I don't want to spend time now on detailing some of our achievements and some of our challenges, but I can assure you that agility was at the center of all of it. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's shift from government to the private sector, actually. I want to turn to Michael next, actually. As I indicated in introducing you, you spent time at Google, previously at GE. You're now working in private advisory firm. What is it about developments in the private sector and developments with technology today that you think are driving a need for Agile regulation?
Thanks, Cary, and it's so great to be with all these wonderful people on this panel. Let me speak to that, but take one small step back and just say that, as we all know when we follow the news on a daily basis, we are living in an era of rapid and impactful transition. We've got climate change, we have pandemics, we have wars, we have massive demographic shifts, and we have rapid and profound technology innovation that's coming at us. And this innovation presents, I think, clear social benefits. Technology has always, at least in my view, and I think most people's views over the centuries, yielded net social benefits, but it also presents real challenges, and real challenges that emerge over time as the technology scales. And I think getting regulatory policy right in a time of rapid and disruptive innovation presents greater challenges to regulators than they may have ever confronted. And I'm extremely empathetic to them, looking at it from the private sector side, but having been in the trenches for 11 years in government. They've got the job of balancing adequate protections of public, society, citizens against encouraging, or at least not necessarily impeding, economic growth, job creation, and innovation. And that is a tall challenge. And when you've got technologies hurtling at you on a weekly and yearly basis that are incredibly complex and inscrutable, and where society's interactions with them is uncertain and changing over time rather quickly, it presents big challenges for regulators to create durable policies that are going to be there over 10 and 20 years to both protect, but also to guide the private sector and how they're supposed to product develop and business plan. And I'll say, coming from GE, but then more relevantly from Google, some of these technologies are so inscrutable that I didn't understand at the company I work for. And I would think there's actually a small cadre of people at Google who really understand the AI algorithms and how digital advertising works. Let me finish by talking about a couple of examples. So you've got these fast, new, and emerging technologies that regulators are supposed to evaluate and decide whether or not to build policy around. You've got self-driving vehicles, you've got commercial drones, you've got genomics, you've got AI and social media. These are tough and they don't always fit into the neat statutory and regulatory frameworks that we've developed. When we were talking to the FAA about a new generation of jet engine at GE, we were talking to regulators who might have worked with us for 30 years and have certificated 3 prior jet engines. Our engine was 6% more efficient, 7% more efficacious. That's a big deal. But we all understood the technology and they were iterating the regulation on top of iterative technology. When you're talking about commercial drones, you're pushing an entirely new aerial technology that's unmanned into, or mostly unmanned, into a manned regulatory framework. That can fry circuits in the regulatory agency because it doesn't fit right. And so they're going to need to be creative and agile and flexible in how they approach it. Last example, this points out the changes in how we interact with technology. So 15 years ago, I'll push it in so we can see it on my screen. This is an iPhone. So when Steve Jobs introduced this 15 years ago, I don't think there's a person alive who didn't say that is a net socially beneficial technology. It's fantastic. 15 years later, I'll speak personally as a father of 2 grown daughters. That is a net disbeneficial technology in my family for all the reasons that we are reading about just this week in the New York Times. Okay, the technology hasn't changed. Still an iPhone. Our relationship with the technology has changed as human beings. If they had done, regulators, a cost benefit on that 15 years ago, I would wager it would be very different than the cost benefit analysis they did 10 years later. And again, it just points to the challenges regulators have in dealing with these technologies and our interaction with them. I'll stop there, but I know we'll return, Cary, later to talk a little bit more about the agile techniques that regulators can use to try to at least adjust more adequately.
I bet 15 years ago, no one was really conceiving that, 10 and 11-year-old kids would be going to school with smartphones and going to sleep with them and all of that. So certainly this is, an example of technology that's changing. Let's go back to government and how it responds. And if I can turn to you, Ed, you've been leading an Agile Government Center at the National Academy of Public Administration. What is it that you see makes for agile government? What does it mean, really, even for government to be agile? And I'd be particularly interested in whether agile government is just the latest fad or buzzword in the field of public administration or even in the field of regulation. We've had other ideas that have emerged over the last several decades. Some of them maybe fallen a bit out of favor. Reinventing government, new public management. Is agile regulation just another flavor of the month or the decade? And you're muted, Ed. And I just invite all of the panel members to take your mics off of mute so you can just join in and jump in whenever you want. And we'll be very agile that way. Go ahead, Ed.
Thanks, Cary, for your ringing endorsement of agile government. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create an integrated framework that brings together all of the elements of developing and implementing policies, regulations, and programs at all levels of government. It's kind of a unified field theory, if you will, of government. And we're doing that by looking at the elements of strategy, organization, and implementation. And we're tracking those across a series of activities: leadership and strategy itself, creation of mission and vision, bringing evidence to bear on all of the things we do in government, and putting metrics in place where customers and the public can understand how networks are being employed using small teams to try to innovate, speed activity, and create persistent use of the tools of government to improve trust. We believe that it's possible by improving the competence of government to increase trust. We've seen in places like the Veterans Administration when Bob McDonnell came in and brought a series of techniques, which he didn't call agile, but turned out to be extremely agile, where the trust in the Veterans Administration went from 55% to 75%. Again, by involving customers, by innovating, by letting the public know what's going on. VA publishes a trust newsletter every quarter that looks at various metrics within its own organization. So what Agile government is trying to do is what happened to Paul Verkuil when ACUS was stood up. It shone a light in his mind. He immediately got the idea that he had to have an agile mindset. He also worked in an integrated fashion across all of the elements of his organization to begin doing the things that he had to do to be able to have ACUS be the powerful force that it is. And in doing so, we believe, and I think he believes, that he improved trust in the regulatory process within the federal government. So agile mindset, integrated framework for action, and trust are the things that we're trying to deal with. Now, if that's a flavor of the month, so be it. I'll take pistachio.
Well, that's really one of the things that I wanted to highlight there, is that agile government and agile regulation may be terms that some of the members of our audience are not as familiar with, but it doesn't mean that governments haven't been trying to be agile in the past. And Heidi, maybe that's a way of fielding a question to you and encouraging you to join in this conversation here. Maybe you can speak to how regulators, in your experience, have been acting in an agile way, or maybe ways that they're not sufficiently agile.
I'm happy to. I'll start by telling you something you don't know about me, or the rest of you on the panel don't know about me. 20 some years ago, I was actually developing software that was at the core of the US financial system. It was 3 people in a room trying to figure out how to do something that was pre-AI, but mimic human intelligence in matching queries for financial information with the massive databases that represent all credit information in the US. 3 people in a room coming up with this. We were not at the time using the terms, the term agile in software development. That term came into common use, I think, a couple of years later. Similarly, in government, we have a lot of best practices that we've been using for years, and we're now recognizing that by following agile principles, we can include more people in improving the effectiveness of their work, and we have a way to train both leaders and staff. At the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, we were a very interesting agency because we had a combination of traditional, I'll call them traditional regulations that were based on metal and plastic, right? It'll be maybe an impact standard, but we also had an oversight authority for recalls, which was very, very flexible. So you could redesign your car every year and be subject to recall if it didn't work. Now, of course, that doesn't offer as much certainty as something like a design standard that airplanes are subject to, but it allows for a great deal more innovation and has allowed for a lot of improvements in vehicles to come to the road. Vehicles now, as you probably know, are one of the most sophisticated pieces of computer design and software that we interact with on a daily basis, unlike the cars 10 and 15 years ago. So the combination of agile principles and traditional principles has allowed that to happen, and will also need to continue to adapt.
Well, and we see just in the last week, NHTSA prodding Tesla for a major recall on its autonomous one of its autonomous systems. So that's active. That active nature is part of what Agile, I think, entails. Maybe to give us some additional examples, I turn to Yael, who's worked on regulatory sandboxes and been studying them in a number of different contexts. If you could share with us, Yael, some examples of Agile regulation in practice around the world, and maybe share what you see as driving the regulators in these contexts to take an Agile approach.
Right, thank you, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. And I agree, it's a huge question about how can regulator achieve this agility, this ability to respond to changes, keeping pace with the changes. And while in software, as Heidi mentioned, so we see these huge books, guidance about how to use different techniques, Scrum, sprints, and so on. They already had 20 years of experience. So here it's really still evolving. And I think the World Economic Forum and the OECD and the Napa report were all, I recommend everyone reading these reports, initial, ideas for techniques that looks very promising, how to really achieve agility. And I think these techniques try to achieve, they go in two directions. So some of them focus on the design. So how can we design the regulatory system in a way that will be more agile and more flexible? So for instance, using when it's possible to use standards that are not very prescriptive, process-based, requiring very specific technology, but rather using outcome-based standards or principle-based standards that give higher flexibility to deal with the changes to begin with. And the other direction, other than the design, the initial design, is the process, which in my opinion is the most interesting part about how we create these regulatory processes that are more agile. And I think it's also it's extremely challenging, obviously. And in that regard, it's not a surprise that the regulatory sandbox has become sort of like the poster child of agile regulation. So it's just this new tool that emerged around 2016. It started in the finance sector regarding fintech companies, but it expanded, and we see it now in so many different sectors, from insurance to transportation to energy, legal services, and more. And while regulatory sandboxes look a bit different from country to country and sector to sector, the general idea is that it creates this structured framework in which regulators can grant specific conditioned waivers that allow businesses to test their innovative technology or a business model in a controlled environment. So, so when a new technology emerges, the regulator doesn't have to decide whether just to block it or to enable a free pass or to apply all regulation or to create new regulation, but it can actually test and learn with the company what are the risks, what are the potentials, and decide accordingly. And this is exactly, I think, the idea of creating these short and rapid cycles that enable both the learning, both to the industry and to the regulator.
That's a great synopsis, and we'll hopefully get into some of these other areas and the issues that they raise, certainly. Michael, Yael had mentioned the report that Napa had produced under the larger initiative that Ed is heading up at Napa. You were involved in this report, and maybe you can help share what insights emerged from that study and what recommendations Napa makes through that project.
Happy to. And so I would first of all encourage folks to take a look at the links, which will be sent to you at the end of this gathering here, because there's 50 or 60 pages of real detail and substance behind the recommendations and the framework that Napa developed. And let me also say, this is a derivation or a cousin of smart regulation or better regulation. And to Ed's point, this is an evolution in smart thinking about how to make regulation the best it can be. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge that it's a new, more modernized and updated conception of what regulators might want to think of doing to meet this world, but it has roots in good thinking over the last 20 or 30 years, and there's no apology for that. Second, the recommendations that the Napa group put out, and it was really a product of incredible staff work at Napa, and then some of us on the expert advisory group who added a little sauce into the bouillabaisse there, but it was really a substantial staff effort centered around 4 key categories: public need, regulatory design, internal process, and continuous learning. And I won't have time here to get into all the different principles and the substance of each. Please take a look at it. But really, the public need is regulators more than ever need to stay on top of the world, right? They need to be very attentive on a daily basis to developments in the world and how society's interacting with it. Things change fast, right? Antitrust authorities may look differently at a company this year than they might have just a year or two ago, right? Meta may be in a different position. Google may face new challenges in the future from Microsoft in the search space that were not apparent 2 months ago. And how's that going to change over the next 12 in a regulatory cycle that might go 5 years? In 5 years, none of this may be germane. So this means regulators have to be really on top of things. In terms of design, thinking very flexibly and adaptably about how to make policy that you can adjust or change more easily over time, right? Because these technologies are going to change. That means using the whole toolkit, the whole regulatory toolkit. That goes from prescriptive regulation on, let's call it the right side, to doing nothing, but making a conscious decision to do nothing on the left. That's a perfectly fine decision for now. It doesn't mean ceding regulatory authority. You're the regulator. You still get to regulate in the end. But the question is, are you willing to iterate into the decision over time so that you're being a little more flexible and adaptable to the technology's evolution? Internal processes, we talked a little bit about, small and inclusive teams that can act more quickly, parallel processes, so you're not doing things sequentially when you can do it in parallel fashion, and utilizing technology more to do the work of government. Now, that requires resources, and we can get back to that, Cary, because I don't want to go on too long.
Sure.
Here, but
yeah.
I think we really do need to address the burning question of resources for regulators if they're to do this right, if they're being asked to. Let me finish with continuous learning. And this is something near and dear to Cass Sunstein's heart, and it was mine as sort of a disciple of his maybe for 3 years. But I think and he just wrote a piece with Cambridge called Test, 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 which I would encourage folks to take a look at. But it really is the idea that, especially today, regulators want to test before and after, meaning if there are opportunities to test technologies in real time in controlled pilot experiments, that's good, because you're going to learn and you're going to apply that to the policy. But you really have to come back retrospectively and take a look at how that policy is interacting with the technology and society, and keep testing the regulatory outcome for adjustment. And so I will end with that and hand the mic back to you, Cary.
Well, maybe I'll turn it over to Larry for that small question about how do we actually get there? I mean, any ideas, Larry, about, as a student of public administration and a scholar of public institutions, how do we design institutions? I mean, I suppose one easy answer is we try to get the Paul Verkuils to head them up, or the Heidi Kings to be administrators, or the DeSeves of the world, and so forth. But anything else about what we can do? Maybe it's the resources question, but maybe it's also an organizational design issue.
I think so too, Cary, and thanks. And it's a joy to be with you all, and welcome aboard to everybody who's tuned in. I think we're in a generational process of reformulating what we teach and what we study, and how we imagine the potential of our public organizations. it kind of starts with this dream state of trying to emulate the private sector. And that idea of increasing the efficiency, the effectiveness of agencies in the mold of the private sector really gave rise to the original revolution of R&D and RAND and better thinking done more quickly by folks who are classically trained in the analytic and evidentiary arts. This is, I think, something new and different, but then buttresses all of that work. First, it attends, I think, really studiously to the idea that government's remoteness is not going to be suitable in the future. This notion that Michael and others have spoken to of this kind of immediacy of iteration, where the insistence on rapidity and greater knowledge of the world out there is no longer this fanciful state that government will never have, but is kind of this prerequisite to optimal function. How do we accomplish that? I think we need new channels. If the traditional channels that we're teaching our administrative law and public management students about rulemaking, adjudication, and other, if we can talk about the range of the delegated authority, including other things, there's all sorts of arts and crafts relative to managing agencies and the like. These are whole different new skill sets, I think. And they're really about learning from the private sector in kind of instantiating immediate customer response and moving from this very diffuse model of the public or the citizenry to this kind of representative set of stakeholders who will give you immediate feedback and kind of trying to refabricate a system where the adjustments would be fine-grained and fast. This has been the dream of analysis all the way along, but we now have these kind of structural problems. One style of problem that I think we can name is what scholars call the last mile problem, where we envision great outcomes from our regulatory designs, but we observe failures and we observe departures from the vision. Do we rest easy on our laurels because we have the perfect rule or the perfect decision in an adjudicatory proceeding? The Agile challenge is that we would no longer do that. And we'd have folks who are in the agencies and representing the agencies out in the field doing much harder thinking and acting in much more incremental ways.
Well, this is really helpful. And I want to just highlight what I'm hearing throughout this conversation so far. Two different ways of thinking about Agile regulation, and I invite any panel member to comment on this or follow it up. One is the kind of agility that is displayed by government regulatory agencies in how they do their work, how quickly they can respond, how vigilant they are in overseeing new technology and going through the learning process. Okay, so that's one way. The other would be, and I think, Larry, you mentioned, rulemaking would be to design rules that themselves are flexible, let's say, agile in the sense of accommodating. I think Yael mentioned standards rather than prescriptive rules. We hear around the world principles-based regulation. Is that a fair dichotomy of what Agile regulation means? Is there a necessary relationship between flexible regulation, the second notion, and an agile regulator? Or could a regulator be agile while still imposing some fairly prescriptive regulations?
And let me just say about that, can a regulator be agile and prescriptive? I think, yes, the answer has to be. On the other hand, most regulators, I would say most career bureaucrats, face a dilemma. There's much greater risk in acting than in not acting. And so why do you step out of your normal framework? What's your reward? And unless you have leadership, as I hope I was when I was in government, that encourages this, you're really reluctant to move out. One good example, at the administrative conference when I first got there, we had a problem that we couldn't decide. We couldn't adjudicate in government effectively enough. This was most prominently shown with the Social Security disability program, where we had something like a 2 million caseload lineup, which would take years to adjudicate under the normal administrative law judge process, which requires a hearing face to face. So what I said, well, what about video? This is before, before Zoom. What about video technology? Let's have the hearings by video. And you can participate by video. You can have witnesses by video and so forth. So what a great idea, right? If you're agile, this would be the first thing you'd want to do. Well, I cannot begin to say all the forces against agility in that context, mainly from the American Bar Association and others who said, oh, no, you have to have a face-to-face hearing. You have to see the adjudicator, the judge has to see the witness. Otherwise, can't tell whether really they're telling the truth. All of this is nonsensical, really, if you look at the psychology behind it. However, that's where we were. So it took, finally, to get the Social Security Administration, we got 20% of all cases to be decided centrally in one place, as opposed to going out every community to have hearings. And those cases were decided in time frames that you cannot believe. We really caught up a lot. Only 20%, however, because the agency was not sure it wanted to go forward. And we then tested the results to make sure there was no outcome effect. And it was true that if you had a video hearing, your chances of prevailing were equally as good as if you had a face-to-face. So we pushed that, but it's still, there's even after COVID, when we've all been on Zoom, by the way, and most agencies are adjudicating, and it's wonderful because it used to be, hearings are open, people are entitled to show up. Well, no, they never did show up in person, but now by Zoom, we have hundreds of people attending various hearings. Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful thing. The point is we can't go back. We have to seize that opportunity and exploit it and expand it so that we can move and make government more effective.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just
Panel
to add
members,
up
jump in.
Great. So just to add up that I completely agree, and I think that an agile regulator can definitely use rigid standards. So just as an example, if we go back to the sandbox example, so when a sandbox is finished, a regulator can either decide, depending on what he learned and the risks and the potential, either to enable the new technology completely because he found out that the risks are not as severe as they initially thought they are, or it can set new very strict rules to facilitate and mitigate the risk that they found. So it really depends on the outcomes and what was learned. And I think this is one of the potentials and the great things about agility, that unlike former theories, maybe new governance that has more lenient toward market-based self-regulation approaches. So here there is no preference. There is just the question of what's right or what's the proper design for the specific problem. So yeah.
Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to riff off of two things that Yael said. So that one, just another flavor of that is the agility to understand whether or not regulations are promoting innovation and a technology or inhibiting it. And I'll just point out an example, because again, this is trying to bring a lot of nuance into this, as we all are, and show how complex the job is, both for regulators and those who work with them. In the commercial drone space, the industry needs a regulatory framework. The lack of agility right now at the FAA in not producing a regulatory framework is causing many commercial drone businesses to die in the valley of death, because if they don't have a license to operate, they can't scale, they can't be functional. And so the frustration is that there is not a reasonable regulatory framework, rules of the sky, if you will, to operate. I think that's a really interesting example of an emerging technology that needs enabling regulation in an agile way in order to scale. On the flip side, the sexy flavor of the year in regulation is going to be AI, right? We already know that. Well, AI is an area where despite a lot of the emerging questions about how this is going to, embed itself in society, regulatory caution might be warranted because there are so many different use cases, and they are each so different that regulators, I think, are going to have a hard time making broad pronouncements on AI regulation. Are going to have to kind of deal with them on their own terms. Facial recognition in your iPhone, which allows you to get into your Wells Fargo app instantly, is wonderful. But facial recognition of a population by a governing sovereign, less so. AI to improve energy efficiency in a wind turbine farm, great. But AI that's being used to determine a probation report's recommendations or whether or not you get a government grant, a lot more problematic. So we've got to kind of approach these technologies on their own terms. The one other point off of Yael's was the global context. I want to put in a huge shout out for international organizations and standard setting organizations, whether they're policy standard setters like OECD or technical standard setters like ISO or IEEE. The value of standard setting efforts is that they are by definition inclusive and consensus driven and technically informed. They're super empirical. And so regulators do and should, I think, look in an agile space, look more and more to standard settings to help guide them on policy, because a lot of the heavy, difficult work has been done for them and the updating will be done for them.
Well, let me get to some of the questions from the audience, and I'll also encourage members of the audience who haven't put your questions in the queue yet to do so. I will try to get to as many of them as I can. And to follow up maybe on Michael, your example from the drone context, you thought that the FAA was insufficiently agile right now because of a lack of sort of an authorizing or an enabling either legislative or regulatory framework in which they'd fit. On the other hand, if you go to the FAA's website, you can look at and see all of the exemptions and waivers, dozens upon dozens of them that the FAA has been issuing in recent decades to accommodate changes in technology and the development of drone technology. And I'm not raising that to necessarily disagree with your characterization, Michael, of the FAA, but rather to raise the question of how do we know when agile regulation is being done well? I mean, from a distance, a regulator might seem to be agile by simply taking a hands-off approach and letting 1,000 flowers and 1,000 drones bloom. Maybe a regulator will be agile if it's not providing, but maybe you'd say that's not good. We need guidance. We need direction from the regulator. So an indecisive or a weak regulator might look agile, but how is it that we distinguish the good agile regulation from ineffectual or irresponsible agile regulation? And I toss that out to anyone. Ed, I know you've been working on good agile
Heidi,
government, and Heidi's been working on this too. So go ahead, Heidi, first.
I'll start with, there's one simple thing, and I'll use the example of self-driving cars. Sometimes just making sure everybody's on the same page is the first step a regulator can take. 4 or 5 years ago, we were all under the impression that self-driving cars would be rolling up and down the streets in our neighborhood with no driver, right? So there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of very hopeful planning from the self-driving car community that raised a lot of concerns in our communities. So, I'd say step one is just level setting on what's real and what's now versus what is developmental and ambitious for some time in the future. That can go a long way to calming the fears or the calls for regulation when something doesn't even actually exist yet. Now, we do, not to suggest that, self-driving cars don't exist yet. We have very limited deployments, limited number in very limited geographies, but they're certainly not rolling up and down all of our neighborhoods the way folks thought they might be 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. Ed? Thank you.
Cary, we have an expression, let 1,000 flowers bloom in straight rows. I credit John Koskinen, the man who did a wonderful job agilely in Y2K. What we're trying to say is you need to have metrics. You need to decide what is your strategy. Okay, let's go back to Paul's example. Paul decided that we needed to significantly speed the process of issuing disability decisions. His metric was how long it took to get a decision put in place. Now, you can start by arguing with Paul's metric. I mean, there may be another metric about was the decision on a review overturned or not. I don't care what they are. Let's put the metrics out there about what the regulations are designed to achieve, and then see if they achieve them or not. So we have 1,000 flowers blooming, but we have a set of metrics that will tell us and the public whether or not we succeeded in our objectives. You can go back and question my objectives, but you can't question the metrics if I tell you what they are and whether I achieve them or not.
So to just take that into the context of the example of the FAA and drones, if they're just issuing a lot of waivers and exemptions, but not within a framework where they've articulated a larger set of principles or guiding metrics, they're only part of the way there, right?
That's right. That's perfectly put, Cary, and that's what I was going to say since I sort of started this, which was I think there were agile moments early in this regulatory cycle back in the Obama administration and maybe rolling into Trump. But now we're 5 years beyond that. And I think the problem is that everything is still very transactional. It's use case by use case. And what is needed is a framework that allows people to operate. I'm not here to be an advocate for the commercial drone industry. I'm just simply pointing out the incongruity sometimes of emerging technologies need regulation, and sometimes they would prefer not. Let me throw one other kind of wrinkle into all of this, and I think Yael will probably relate to this quite a bit with the global perspective is sometimes I think how we approach agile regulation and how we approach the regulation of technology differs country to country, culture to culture, and it depends a lot on what the needs are of that country and how technology can bring benefits. So in the US and Europe, if I may say, we have very developed economies. We are very wealthy relative to the rest of the world. And we have the luxury, and I don't mean this as a negative value statement, of worrying about a lot of features, let's call them costs or challenges of technology, that other countries and cultures don't have the luxury of worrying as much about. So in the drone context, we might worry a lot about surveillance or privacy violations of you if a drone's flying over and taking a picture of someone sunbathing in their backyard. That is not something that people want to have happen, and it is a real challenge. If you're trying to deliver blood to a remote village in Kenya using commercial drones, and this technology has suddenly solved a massive infrastructure problem, you might not worry about some of these privacy concerns. Not that they're unimportant, they just pale in comparison to the problem solved and the benefits gained by the technology. And so in Kenya, it's a lot easier to use commercial drones. It's scaled, and they didn't have maybe quite the well-developed manned flight regime that we have in the US, right? And so I just want to point out that when we talk about agility, it's oftentimes contextual because of the needs of a group of citizens, a country, or a culture.
And Yael, do you want to respond to that?
Just to follow up that regarding the drones, I think maybe the problem there with you have to have even when you're doing a sandbox, you have to have an exit strategy. So you need to know, at the end, you can't go into this vicious circle without getting out of it toward a more permanent framework. So maybe that's the story there. And as for, I completely agree about the global look, and of course, countries can have different priorities, but I think also countries have different administrative law, administrative systems. Each sector has its own uniqueness in one country, and like in Israel, the startup nation, so there is more openness maybe to ideas of agility than in other countries that are more formal. So yeah, and I agree. And each country has to really adopt this approach to its own unique characteristics.
That's a great point. One question from the members of the audience is, does agile regulation contribute to, or does that way of thinking about regulation facilitate regulatory capture more easily? And there may be differences in terms of the regulatory cultures, if you will, within different countries and the degree to which they're driven by and captured by industry. I don't know if that's a particular worry that anybody wants to comment on. Larry, you wanted to get in the conversation.
No, I think it's a brilliant point, and building on what others have said, I want to move to the other side of the house at the FAA and talk about the 737 MAX. I think the notion of testing in our imagined avoidance of those tragedies and the high cost of having to ground an entire airline system, I think the notion would have been that agility would have slowed things down, or agility would have emphasized greater testing. Now, to Michael's point, one of the recognitions there would be the gravity of the potential losses and gains. I think if we are able to kind of calibrate the reacculturation of our processes, we would be in different contexts if we're talking about emerging technologies that need basic rules of the road in order to get going. Particularly where the potential losses at the margin don't look as calamitous as some other administrative errors might be. So I think there's a lot of judgment calls that have to be made. And the last point I want to make here to kind of just buttress on this kind of comparative international frames is that, I think that the highly kind of micro-adversarial cultures that we have in the United States really serve to inhibit the ways in which we can make our agencies more agile, because the challengeability, the vocalization of those challenges, and the expression of rights-oriented claims in delaying everything everywhere all the time really is a huge stumbling block for the kind of reform we're talking about.
And that's if agile means imposing some regulations or oversight. If it is simply a hands-off approach and letting, again, the flowers bloom wherever they lay, then I guess that might be something that facilitates. In fact, one of the questions in the audience asks whether, really at the end of the day, if this is an approach that's driven by or motivated by the emergence of new technologies with maybe, unquantified yet benefits and unquantified yet costs, are we operating just in complete uncertainty? And maybe the strategy for regulators is just to take a hands-off approach, let the innovations go forward, and then when we do see what's happening with them, step in.
Well, can I just comment on that, but back to the capture point, because I think that's really sharp. I think we want to be clear. Agile regulation doesn't always have to be everywhere. And second, agile regulation does not mean deregulation or no regulation. Okay, I just think we want to be humble in our conception of agile regulation, just as regulators need to be humble when they deal with emerging technology. The Boeing situation, which we could do a whole nother hour on, was in a heavily regulated 10 to the -7 safety kind of framework, right? And people die when you get it wrong. And I think that's a tricky example, because there may be qualities of what was happening at the FAA that people might point and saying that was agile. We were really partnering with the industry. We were offloading certain responsibilities to industry that we felt like they were more capable of doing. But what ended up happening, I think is apparent, is that profit motive dominated on one side and regulatory oversight was non-existent on another. And you had a capture moment, which was fatal. That's, I think, a different domain when you're dealing with certification of a new airplane than when we're talking about how are we going to address an AI technology in the healthcare space, right? And so I just think we want to be we want to be careful about saying that although these agile principles should proliferate everywhere in their full glory in all circumstances, I think that isn't the case. And I think capture is a worry. One last point on capture. Sometimes big firms benefit from highly prescriptive regulatory regimes because they're the only ones with the resources to comply.
Right.
So maybe Google's okay with GDPR at the end of the day, and a whole bunch of small and medium-sized European firms were not. And that's a bit of an irony.
Heidi?
You know, I want to come back and just make sure we're clear on the point that, at least my view, and I think it may be the view of other panelists, but please chip in, is that not that Agile needs to be everywhere. If you have a technology, let's say it's building a power plant and it takes years to design, it takes years to build, and it's going to operate for years, we're not necessarily suggesting that's the place where Agile is going to knock it out of the park, right? That's a long-term investment. It has a long time where you need to get a return. But there are some other things. For example, in Europe, you can use a side view mirror on your car, which is a mirror instead of having an actual mirror. And that's very difficult for us to embrace here in the US because it's not that it's better or worse, because in some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse, but it's just different. So that's one point I want to make is I don't think, so I at least would not advocate Agile everywhere, but with digitization and rapidly changing technology, we got to keep up, or by the time the regulation gets out the door, it's already irrelevant and people are already non-compliant and there may be greater dangers or loss of public well-being. So that's, I'll stop with that point actually and let other folks pitch in.
All right. Great. Well, that's important, and it raises a good question about the role of regulatory analysis that I hope we can come back to in a minute as well. Yael, you wanted to?
I just agree that the concern of regulatory capture is probably one of the greatest concerns here, and how can we achieve agility without fragility? And I do agree with Michael that sometimes stagnation can be, and serve the industry even better than rapid changes. So we have to be aware of that. And I think that in most cases it will be just a question of the right design. So, for instance, if I'll have a regulatory sandbox, but I will have no transparency and all the waivers and the exemptions will not be published to the public, so there will be no public supervision over these processes. That's where I'll be more concerned of capture than on the other cases. So it's all about how to design these tools in a way to overcome capture. So that's, I think, this is the real challenge.
I think this reinforces the thousand flowers blooming in a row and in the sunshine, right? As well. So Yael, you spent some time in Israel working on the Israeli equivalent of our Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and Michael and Heidi, you worked at the U.S. Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and we've got a number of questions from the audience. Asking about how to square this notion of agile regulation with a process of benefit cost analysis of new rules that go through OIRA review that many people have criticized for many years as slowing down the regulatory process, as wanting to be comprehensive and totally rational and understanding what the benefits and costs are in quantified, and if we can, in monetized terms. How do you square that whole movement toward regulatory impact assessment with now what sounds like could be an approach that's much more nimble, piecemeal, and much more rapid as Heidi, you were saying, in response to the rapid pace of change in the industry. So Heidi, you want to take that one first?
Sure, and as former OIRA and also former agency and also as a former regulated entity, I share a lot of those concerns and questions. I do think that OIRA sometimes adds a lot of value. It's important to have a process that ensures quality before regulations are unleashed upon the public and the economy. But I do think that some of the principles of agile regulation can apply very well to OIRA as well as to the regulated entity, or actually the regulating entity. what I had found is that oftentimes the higher profile regulations, there's very early and collaborative communication around what the regulation will be. And so OIRA's role is to be knowledgeable and help shape good thinking on the regulation, but not to delay things, not to make it slow, not to make it, and somehow changed from what the agency is doing, so it can more quickly get to the public. There are other times, and I'm afraid this is true in the US across the regulatory spectrum, the regulations that are less high profile may just kind of slog along and not get the attention either at agency in the leadership or at OIRA. And so as a result, they move slowly. And it seems to be either the agency or OIRA that's slowing things up, when in fact, there just aren't the resources to attend to every single regulation that's in the queue. So I think the concern is very legitimate. I think we find ways, early engagement, teaming early in regulatory development, open communication that's trusting, so that the rule can go out to the public knowing that government is comfortable seeking comment or seeing it implemented.
Is there a faster way to doing benefit cost analysis? Chris Kerrigan and Stuart Shapiro have a nice paper about back of the envelope benefit cost analysis. Is that something that you think OIRA would, a little bit more agile mentality at OIRA could facilitate that as a vehicle?
One of the things that worries me is that we do have regulations that go out without benefit cost analysis. It may come out of a regulatory agency that is independent and not subject to OIRA review. So I do think that we invest immense resources in a small number of regulations, and they're very important regulations, but we also have almost no information on the benefits and costs of some other very important regulations. We assume they're not that important because they haven't had that quantification. I think there could be more shortcuts in some of the big regulations. I am a fan of benefit cost analysis because it shapes clear thinking on the regulatory mechanism. I'm more concerned about the disparities across agencies and what they actually perform than I am about individual rule benefit cost analyses.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on Heidi, I will say, first of all, the length of our rulemaking process is contributed to by OIRA, but I would say the lion's share of it occurs at the agency level. It still takes a long time for an agency to develop a proposed rule that gets to OIRA for a 40, 90, or if it goes over 120-day review. And then there's a long period of comment taking, comment analysis, redefining the rule and submitting it again. So I think proportionality is important. Having said that, it's perfectly, I think, clear that there can be regulations where the OIRA process adds to the delay and they can get bogged down. I don't think doing good empirical work and as good a cost benefit analysis, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or monetized, and there's no requirement on that, it's the best you can do, is in any way in contradiction to Agile regulation. In fact, I think it's a bulwark of Agile regulation. I think that you want to be as empirical as you can in trying to assess what the likely impacts, benefits, costs are on society. And you want to be as open and participatory with the public and the regulated entities in the making of it. You really want to crowdsource people's views on these items. So, I don't think it's anathema. I would say, and then a last point, Agile regulation isn't all about process, right? Process is important, but design is equally important. And I would say concepts of Agile design are very in keeping with approaches that OIRA, favors or wants to explore. Whereas I do think streamlining process can often be a point of contention between OIRA and the agency. And I think that would be a challenge for OIRA to say, wait a minute, in this circumstance, and they've stepped up at times of crisis, you've got to agree to a streamlined process, even though it's not the norm. But I think OIRA will be much more sympathetic to Agile design concepts. Heidi, does that sound right to you, or is that?
Yeah, it actually, I'm sorry. Yes, And I also think that, in fact, OIRA has played the role of pressing for agile concepts, at least in my experience.
In the design aspect of a rule. Sure.
Yes, because I
Yeah.
don't want to fail to note that we actually have quite a few elements of our regulatory system that are agile. We're now putting it into a framework. We're using the word agile and defining it so that more people can take advantage of those tools. But we do have some agile regulations that we've been benefiting from and learning from.
Sure.
So
In terms
one
of
of the most.
flexible- Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
It's good to talk about OIRA in this context, and hopefully under new leadership, they'll be listening carefully to what we're suggesting. But that brings to me the major point. It's who's in charge. If you're in an administration that wants to get things done and achieve goals, then having agile is a real asset. But if you're in an administration that wants to make sure you don't issue a rule because they don't want any more regulation, then it doesn't much matter. Nothing else, agility or not, won't be important. And I think going back to that, it's who you appoint and for what purpose are they appointed. If you appoint people who want to get things done and have a good view of the world and are experienced, then agile plays a good role.
I guess it also depends, Paul, maybe on what does it mean to get things done too. Go back to, I mean, I think Michael was right that agile doesn't mean deregulation, but in some administrations, maybe they would want to have an agile deregulatory agenda in terms of being rapid, swift, and would that make any sense at all?
That's a good point, because now this is where the courts come in. It's very hard to get a regulation done, but also under judicial precedent, it's very hard to get it undone.
Sure.
So, and we have to keep that in mind. To me, the biggest problem in regulation for an administrator is what's called obsolescent regulations. Regulations in statutes and agencies that were passed during the 30s and sometimes even earlier now have to be adapted to present needs. They're all obsolete, and we know for sure, and given how the Congress works these days, that there's not going to be any legislation to solve your problem, right? We're stymied. The legislative branch is sort of out to lunch. They're not coming back, no matter who is in charge. That's pretty much the rule. So therefore, it's up to the administrator to do with an obsolete regulation what she or he needs to do, which is to update it by issuing a rule, and hopefully OIRA will support that, which may be on the margins of legality, and we can find out later, as we did famously, I think the biggest regulatory achievement has been tobacco. You think about it, in the last 30 years, since the Clinton years, when President Clinton personally, by the way, took the head of the FDA into his Oval Office and said, explain this regulation. And it was dramatic. And this changed public policy. Can you think of a more important one other than maybe what's coming with climate change? But ultimately, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, because no one would have thought when the FDA Act was passed that a cigarette could be an instrument of, but it didn't matter, by the way. The regulator had won, because by the time it got to the Supreme Court some 3 or 4 years later, we had settled the tobacco problem, private litigation on top of it all. So if you're the regulator and see that as a lesson, which way do you go? Do you take the risk and issue the regulation and get support from it? You have to get support right from the administration. Or do you sit back, as it be the temptation of regulators, and let it pass?
Yeah, and it's a great point about Congress and its pace, and raises a question that someone posed in the Q&A function. Can you be an agile regulator all on your own in a larger system of government that may be atrophied or polarized and gridlocked. It's interesting in the tobacco case, after the Supreme Court in Brown and Williamson struck down the FDA's effort to regulate tobacco, Congress did step in about 10 years later and specifically authorized FDA to regulate tobacco. So, can we really deal with these new technologies if there's not a sufficient working relationship between the executive and the legislative branches? It's not just a question of OIRA, but also bringing in Congress into the picture is, I think, important too. Yeah.
So the lesson, all I'm saying is, just for a second,
Yeah.
the lesson in that example is that, yes, sometimes you were determined not to be beyond your authority, but you won anyway because the statute was updated. It's no longer obsolete.
Right. Exactly. Heidi?
I'm going to, the question that you suggested sounds like it's coming from one of our colleagues in federal government, and I have a partial answer. We can always be more agile. We can always be pressing ourselves. So for instance, we can always be trying harder to engage earlier so as not to be sequential in working together, but actually try to get earlier in the process, get one's questions vetted. We can look for mechanisms that are more agile. So each of us as individuals can try. It may not be, going to make the front page of the New York Times. The other point I want to make is that oftentimes the agile conversation is coming up because of digitization, and digitization cuts across federal agencies and cuts across different authorities with different case law, different histories in both regulation and litigation. And so they may have very different sensitivities. So I do think that one of the steps that our federal colleagues might take, and also our colleagues in the private sector who are working with them, is to try and reach across agencies, build relationships, and make sure that we have trusting, thoughtful relationships about agile solutions that cut across agencies, that cut across the White House and OMB. So, because one of the key principles in Agile is this collaboration and problem solving together and not sequentially, right? So that's something that's very important. And because we're all very busy, it's often very hard to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that it takes being deliberate to be agile. And it may take us out of our comfort zone and may take, going to more effort. That might take in the short term even more time than we might prefer. But Ed?
Heidi just touched on one of the most important elements of Agile, in my opinion. It is networks, consciously building networks. So after the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was during the World Series, and Larry was probably there, somebody said, well, you guys did a really good job of getting things back together, getting transportation working back together, and having all the emergency people work together. What was your secret? I looked him in the eye and said, softball. I mean, softball. Turns out all the emergency management agencies in the greater San Francisco area used to have a picnic every year and play softball together. And so they knew that this guy was Pete from San Pedro, or this guy was from San Francisco, or this guy was from South San Francisco. They knew what he did. They knew what his phone number was. They knew how to stay up with him. And around that, they built a series of networks that allowed rapid emergency response. My favorite emergency response network is the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise. They can put 1,500 people on the ground to fight a fire within 24 hours because 5 federal agencies entered into a compact, a legitimate legal compact to provide services one to the other. No question about our appropriated dollars being used properly. We're not talking about that. We're talking about is getting air support, getting water regulations to be able to do things, getting sheriffs involved. And that's because of pre-positioning of networks to be able to do things. The same thing is true in the regulatory area. We should have the ability to work with industry groups, to work with others. The World Economic Forum said this when they talked about their regulatory environment. So I think Heidi hit it right on the nose. Collaboration through pre-positioned networks is essential.
Thanks, Ed. Michael? You're muted, I think.
I didn't push hard enough. Thanks. Building off networks, I think networks of regulators who have overlapping or concurrent jurisdiction is important. In the UK in 2020, Ofcom, the CMA, so the big digital media regulator, CMA, which is the antitrust regulator, ICO and FCA, all came together and created essentially a consortium of regulatory agencies to tackle a lot of these issues in concert. In my view, that's agile, right? You're not creating 4 potentially duplicative and conflicting regulatory approaches. You're bringing the regulators who all have some equities together and say, let's create a harmonized, holistic approach. That takes time and energy. And as Heidi said, it's different. So sometimes that doesn't, or maybe it was Paul or somebody was saying, so sometimes change isn't easily accommodated in bureaucracy, but I think that's really important. And I don't want this conversation to end before we talk about resources for just one moment, because we're putting a lot on regulators to be more agile, but it would be unfair for them to be saddled with that without resources. And so, trying to circumvent the despair that Paul has rightfully expressed about whether the legislative branch can come together to provide agencies with more resources to do their job as opposed to less. These agencies need resources. They need them to hire more FTEs to do this work. They needed to hire more expertise. That's expensive. You may be hiring out of the private sector into government to get that. They need to be able to procure technologies that are going to help them do their jobs better, including maybe AI-based technologies that are going to help in the decision-making process and the analytic process. So I just think it's important for us to also put some responsibility on legislatures to provide regulators with the tools they need to be more agile.
And sometimes those tools, are resources. And somebody in the chat or the Q&A says more staff for OIRA, for example. But sometimes it also may be, to go back to Paul's earlier point, the need for Congress to step in and give the agencies clearer authority, right? And I guess I want to close really with some discussion that's been on the minds of many of our members of the audience here from the United States. So last year, the Supreme Court decided a case, West Virginia versus EPA, in which it announced what it's now calling the major questions doctrine, which makes agencies confront perhaps a new or higher hurdle when they want to use one of these older statutes that may not have been written with contemporary circumstances in mind, going back to one of the very early aspects of change that Michael mentioned, climate change. That was at the heart of that case directly, but also you mentioned COVID, and there were 2 cases from the Supreme Court on its shadow docket that also struck down efforts by OSHA and by the CDC to respond to COVID under older existing statutory provisions in a new way. Is this major questions doctrine a major hurdle for agile regulation? Who wants to weigh in on that? Paul?
Well, I would say, yes, it is a major hurdle. I think we don't know yet how major, because the court will have to rally together a little more after this case. But go back to Brown and Williamson. That was the point of Brown and Williamson, that you cannot update statutes. If they're obsolete, then you're stuck with them. The major questions doctrine is basically a form of the non-delegation doctrine, which says that you're not permitted to regulate unless Congress has explicitly given you the authority. And that, of course, that case goes back to the 1930s, Schechter-Poultry in 1935. So it was the New Deal that they were trying to stop then. Now it's climate regulation, things that really aren't explicitly covered by statute, which are so urgent, just like tobacco was 20 years ago. And if a Supreme Court is going to take this view, they can stymie anything, because I do not believe Congress is capable of responding. It's a little bit facetious for the court. Well, that's okay. Let's just send it to Congress. They'll fix the problem. Well, they do not anymore fix the problem. And to say that when you know in your heart as a judge, when you say that it's not going to happen, it is really disingenuous. And that's where major questions, which is a made-up thing that the court is using, can really stymie the future of important regulation, because the statutes aren't up to date. The agencies, by the way, operate under something called the public interest standard, which may even be in jeopardy in itself because it's so vague. And we want a Supreme Court that's not the pre-New Deal Supreme Court. We want the one that came afterwards, the so-called switch in time to save 9 Supreme Court. That's the one we need now, in some ways. And I really think they must know this deep down and have to worry a little bit about the imposition of the judicial branch on the future of government.
Well, it may moderate, perhaps. We'll see. You're right. It's the future is unclear where the court will take it. But one scenario could have that the major questions doctrine forces agile regulation to depend on agile legislation, and if that's non-existent, or if that's an oxymoron, then we're sunk. Yael, closing comments here. We'll
sure.
wrap.
So I just
we'll
wanted to, I agree that one line of an possible argument is, of course, the concern it will inhibit agility, but I want to offer also a different perspective that maybe agility can be the solution to the new major question doctrine. So if regulators will take smaller steps and you throughout this spiral process of agile processes, so that's almost by definition makes the policy not a major question. So maybe agility can also serve as a solution.
I think that it may make the premium for being agile all the greater for government, in the face of these challenges. Heidi? Yes.
I love Yael's answer. That's wonderful. So my understanding of the decision is it didn't say how we work together internally within the federal government. We can do so much more there. That's one thing. And the other thing I want to say in closing is not everything's a major question. So if we can't do it on the small stuff, maybe we shouldn't be doing it on the big stuff yet. We can do so much more on non-major questions to improve our agility and responsiveness and timeliness and relevance of regulations in this fast-changing world.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, I want to sound like an academic here for a minute, if I may. Charles Lindblom of Yale created the doctrine of disjointed incrementalism. Those of you may know it. It's also called muddling through. And I think if we muddle through agilely, we may be in the right place. We can't optimize everything all the time. There's not a perfect world. So we're acting in disjointed incremental fashions, but also in agile fashions. And I think that's what we find ourselves in.
I'll invite other closing comments. Larry?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point to end on, Ed, that maybe the muddling through that we most need is a kind of a contemplative learning posture. If suddenly the SEC said, well, we've got everything we need in terms of authorization. Here we come with our blockchain regulation. Full stop. We've done the cost benefit analysis, and we have certitude that it accurately predicts the future. When there's a sense of overstepping, those who would naturally be obstructionists anyway may take advantage of the structures of government to slow us down. But if instead there is a collaborative network of agencies with putative authority saying, I think we should probably keep an eye on blockchain. There are great opportunities and there are some threats. And our muddling through will begin by thinking like designers in the discovery phase. And maybe that's a posture we need to kind of inaugurate formally to really make this progress real in the world.
So Michael and then Paul, any closing remarks as we wind down this session? Yeah, you're muted again.
That seems to be I'm not agile in that regard. I just wanted to thank you and the rest of the panelists for a great 90 minutes. I haven't had this much fun talking about regulation in a long time. So thank you.
Well,
and I can have fun talking about regulation. So this was great. Thanks.
That's high praise. Appreciate it, Michael. And Paul?
Well, I can't do better than that. I really have enjoyed it as well. And I must say, I do think the future is bright for Agile, just because if you have ambition, you want to be agile to get things done. And we want to see that.
Absolutely. So we've given our audience members a lot to think about. We've also, though, left a number of questions on the table, and I'm apologetic to those in the audience whose questions we did not have time to get to. Perhaps we'll have a round 2 down the road. We will certainly be thinking a lot about what Agile regulation means and how to do it better. We'll follow up with everyone with various links to reports and the like, and we'll put this recording on YouTube as well. I want to close by thanking all of our panel members for your engagement here today, for your insight, and for being willing to be agile as we managed an online conversation with 6 of you. It was really a lot of fun and very insightful. And I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank all the members of the audience who have joined us today from around the world. We hope that you have taken away some ideas that you can put into practice and make government better, make regulation better. That's ultimately the aim, I think, of Agile regulation, is to do better in the face of what are very daunting circumstances and dynamic change in the world. So thank you one and all for being with us. This concludes our panel discussion, and I wish you all a good rest of the day.